Well, what we've got is a very important book that I have an interesting time thinking about in terms of my own personal history. I remember the day back more than 50 years ago now that I was a graduate student. And I think at that point in the 1960s, if somebody would have said, you're going to be moderating a book discussion on the global jihad, and you're going to be doing that in the 21st century, everybody would have simply laughed. Everybody would have said, John, isn't that an imaginative thing? We know what the future of those kind of movements are. And I want to start with comparing two quotes to show what an important kind of time we are in with this global jihad. From my old newspaper clipping file, and one of the advantages of being a really old geezer is that you sometimes have lots of old clippings and things. There was in the New York Times in February of 1968, there was an article, front page article, and the headline was "For Religion." And the first paragraph says, by the 21st century, now remember that's where we are now, okay? By the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects, huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture, a worldwide secular culture. This is what the New York Times was told by a major sociologist of religion called Peter Berger. Berger recognized 50 years later that he was wrong, but I want to compare that quote. Let me just say again, by the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture. Now let me just take the book that we're talking about today and look at the very first sentence in the preface. From al-Qa'ida's 9/11 terror attacks in the United States to the ISIS caliphate and its reign of violence in the Middle East, Europe, and beyond, global jihad has captured headlines, impelled vast national policies, and seized the imagination of people around the world in recent years. This book that Glenn will be introducing to us and that we'll be talking about, this book shows what a dramatic change has taken place in the structure, not just of religion, but of global politics and globalization. We have a professor, a scholar, a consultant. He's on the faculty of the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey and connected with the University of California in Berkeley, and has been one of the pioneers in interdisciplinary understanding of the major movements within the Muslim world.
Thank you very much, John, for that kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be at Georgetown, and physically here, even if most of the people that are observing today are with us in a digital sense. So this is a talk about a book that is just published earlier this year from Stanford University Press. And so what I'd like to do is, I've got some slides here, is to go over the contents of the book by way over the next 30 minutes or so, just by way of, there we go, just by way of introducing the book and setting some themes and opening up the discussion from there. I think Andrew is going to be moderating that discussion. So let's get right into it. In this book, I make two arguments, and I have an unwritten motivation here I'll mention in a moment as well. But the two arguments that you find, the primary one is an interpretive argument about how to understand this phenomenon that we've seen for the last 4 decades. This is not some ancient issue. It is a very modern, very recent, contemporary political movement of global jihad. Where you've had, I argue, 4 very distinctive iterations of global jihad over the last 4 decades. I use the term waves. We don't think of them as sort of sequential, evenly spaced out waves, but 4 iterations that have gone on, one of which continues to this day, 3 of which have largely passed. So each of these 4 iterations of global jihad are global jihad, right? They make an argument about armed jihad, jihad of sight, the jihad of the sword, and they're identifying primary issues at a global systemic level. These are not local jihad groups that are trying to overthrow a local regime or grab a patch of land or something similar. These are people that make an argument about the necessity for armed violence under the banner of Islam at the global level. And I say there have been 4 very distinctive iterations of this, each with a very unique cause that basically launches a new wave, and with a unique ideological answer to that crisis. So that's the primary purpose of the book, and most of the book is about making that interpretive argument about how to understand. I mean, we're at the point in time where I think we can step back and say, okay, how do we understand, looking back on this movement, how do we understand it in a big picture way? So that's most of the book. The second argument that I make, and it is a provocative argument, make towards the end of the book, I'll make towards the end of my 30 minutes or so speaking today, is to ask the question, where does this phenomenon, this global jihadi political movement, where does it fit into the universe of violent political movements over the last century or so? And there is a tendency in many ways, as people in this center I think know perhaps better than most, to treat anything in the Muslim world as sui generis, which is a sort of a form of Orientalism. I try and say, look, this is what we see here is comparable to some interesting other political movements that shared features that I'll get into in a minute. So it's not really a sui generis thing. There are some comparisons, some interesting comparisons to be made across cultural and geographic boundaries with other movements. So we'll get into that issue in just a moment. Not a bullet point, but I do have an unwritten motivation here. Being at the Naval Postgraduate School, having military officers as my students, issues of violence are sort of natural things. It's always interested me in any case, but natural things to discuss. So I've been reading in this literature for a long time, and frankly, you know, if I may, 90% of the stuff that gets written on global jihad is just junk. It's not strong analysis. It's usually replete with Islamophobia, and it's not the kind of stuff that I'd ever want to assign in a classroom to graduate students, for example. So I wanted to write a book that could analyze this topic in a serious scholarly way, but without resorting to the sort of Islamophobic tropes that are so common. All right, so those are the 2 big arguments. Just briefly, of course, I try and set the stage. This global jihad phenomenon that started in the 1980s did not start in a vacuum. There was a history here. And so I go through that history a bit, beginning with the rise of Islamism or political Islam. Professor Esposito and others here have written extensively about this. Very much a 20th century phenomenon, very much linked with the rise of mass societies in the 20th century and the ongoing scourge of colonialism, also in the early part of the 20th century. that led to the fellow at the top of your screen, Hassan al-Banna, to found the Ikhwan Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, in 1928 in Egypt. Groups like the Ikhwan Muslimin, either groups themselves, sister organizations or similar kinds of organizations, popped up throughout the 20th century in most Muslim majority countries around the Muslim world. As a general principle, political Islam groups like the Muslim Brotherhood have tended not to emphasize violence. I don't want to say they're peaceniks that never utilize violence and always eschew it. They have ever used violence. But it has tended to be seen, violence has tended to be seen as a tactic that becomes necessary from time to time. But it's not a cornerstone of the ideology of the group. It's sort of the forward vision of Islamism writ large. In the 1960s and early 1970s, there was a second major step along the path. And that was the laying of an intellectual architecture of jihadism. Again, we're not talking about sort of traditional jihad dating back to the dawn of time, but jihadism as an ideology, as a political ideology that espoused the use of violence. This intellectual architecture was put together, I argue, in large measure because of the failure of Islamism to create significant differences on the ground, particularly in the Middle East. So this intellectual architecture, there are a lot of individual ideologues in both the Shia world and the Sunni world. In the Shia world, I have a picture of Ayatollah Khomeini here, who was one of these ideologues that sort of more subtly but clearly espoused the necessity of the use of force to overthrow what he viewed as an illegitimate regime in Tehran. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't the only cleric. Ayatollah Talabani made similar arguments at the same time. Ali Shariati, which many of you will know of, was probably the most important ideologue of the 60s and 70s that made a similar kind of argument. For the jihadis, violence is a cornerstone. You can't get to the political project because your pathway is blocked, and you need to unblock it through the use of violence. There's no other answer to it. Was the jihadi response. The current head of al-Qa'ida, for example, another Egyptian, made the case years ago. He wrote an entire book castigating the Muslim Brotherhood for not picking up arms, for taking a nonviolent approach towards social and political change. So this is the issue of violence separates, in my mind, is the most important differentiator between Islamists and jihadis. And again, I go into more detail in the book. In the 1980s, now you have a variant of jihadism arises, which is looks at the problems in front of the Muslim world in a global, systemic way, and again, not in a local, one country way. All right, so let's get into this. Just to fill out the pictures on your screen. Again, two of the important ideologues that laid this intellectual architecture for armed jihad. You see them on your screen. The Khomeini I've mentioned. There's Said Qutb behind bars, who in many ways was the most important Arab Sunni jihadi ideologue, the first and most important. He wrote a book in 1964 called Ma'alim fi Tariq, signposts along the road or milestones, which is essentially akin to Lenin's small book, What is to be Done. And for Qutb, this was a call for the use of, not only the use of armed jihad, but including the use of armed jihad to overthrow what he viewed as a apostate, although he used the word jahili. This is a little bit different meaning, but a jahili regime in Cairo. So again, a call to arms. And the two folks at the bottom, you'll learn, if you don't already know them, much more about in the next few minutes. Abdullah Azzam on the left, Abu Musab Asuri on the right. So let's get into the first wave. The first wave really comes out of the 1980s. I use the number here, 1979, Why? Because December of '79 is when the Soviet Union invaded and occupied Afghanistan, and that is the thing that launched ultimately the first wave of global jihad. But there are a number of ideologues, and most importantly, the fellow on your screen, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, a Palestinian Jordanian, one of the few ideologues of global jihad that actually has a serious religious credential. He studied and got his doctorate at Al-Azhar in Cairo, a very prestigious place. He looked around the world and said, look, Afghanistan is not sui generis. It is not unique. What we see in Afghanistan about the occupation of Muslim lands, historically Muslim lands, by a non-Muslim infidel power, there are a dozen other places around the world where you see this. Next would be Palestine. That was very high on his list, as he was very upfront about. But not just Palestine. Look at the 5 Central Asian republics that are now independent, but at the time were ruled out of Moscow. Look at Kashmir in northern India. Look at Mindanao in the southern Philippines, and a number of other places, historically Muslim lands where you still have large Muslim populations, but ruled over by infidel powers, according to Azzam. Azzam was the most prolific ideologue of the Afghan jihad of them all. He was a very charismatic leader, very popular as well, and traveled the world, including coming to the United States on at least 2 occasions to raise money and awareness for and of the Afghan jihad. He wrote extensively. Here at the bottom of your screen are his 2 most important works. They've been translated into English. Not all of his work has been. So what did Azzam do that was different from sort of the normal types of jihadis that were commonly found in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere in the 1980s? Here are 4 things. We can talk a little bit about some of these others during the Q&A, such as jihad as permanent revolution and the link he makes to Tawheed, which is very interesting. The cult of martyrdom, for which Azzam was essentially the primary architect. But the thing I want to spend time on here is that second bullet point, what I term in my book the Jihadi International. Now, the phrase that Azzam uses, and lots and lots of folks used it at the time in the 1980s, was al-Qa'ida as-Sulba, al-Qa'ida as-Sulba, which translates as the solid base or the solid foundation. And what Azzam and other jihadi ideologues in the Afghanistan area meant by that in the 1980s was territory, a solid base of territory. And once you have created and gotten control of that solid base, then, and what they meant, not just any old territory, they were obviously talking about Afghanistan. That's what they meant. Once we liberate Afghanistan from the Soviet Union, we have our solid base, our Qa'ida Sulba, and we can expand out from there in various ways. In the last 2 years of Abdullah's life, Abdullah Azzam's life, he started to rethink this notion. And by the way, I've got on the screen here another new book, came out just a few months before mine, by Thomas Heghammer, which is a very long but brilliant biography of Abdullah Azzam. And so if you want to follow up with much greater detail of his life, I highly recommend that book. But in April of 1988, Azzam writes an article, a short article, in the magazine that you see on the top of your picture. And the title of the short article is this same phrase, al-Qa'ida Sulba. But he lays out a very different vision. So this is the sort of the first vision of a permanent global jihad. And he now understands al-Qa'ida Sulba not to mean territory, not to mean Afghanistan or some other territory, but to mean a pious warrior class that would be trained in various ways and would go around the world, work with Muslim populations to liberate occupied lands from infidel powers. Again, these dozen or so places around the world. This was a radical rethinking of this very key doctrine that jihadis shared at the time. Azam was assassinated just a year later, in early 1989. The Soviet, excuse me, later in 1989, early 1989, the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan. And Azam never had the opportunity to sort of fill out what he meant more by this reinterpretation of al-Qa'ida Sultan. I call it, this is my phrase, not his, I call it the Jihadi International. Why? Because this is the exact same vision that you saw in the Leninist world in the 1917s, 1920s in particular, following the 1917 revolution in Russia, where, and they refer to that as the Communist International, or the Comintern as it's often called. The Communist International was designed to create an activist warrior class that would travel about Europe primarily, work with oppressed populations to help liberate them from bourgeois domination, bourgeois repression, and then they would move on to the next battleground. So Azam's vision is exactly the same as the Jihadi International, or the Communist International, but it's one of armed jihad as opposed to rebellion against bourgeois repression. All right, so this is the first kind of big picture vision of global jihad. Global because it stretches around basically Africa to the far reaches of Asia and other places as well. So this is a global issue. Again, a pious warrior class that would work with local Muslim communities to liberate their lands. Very much a territorial-based view of global jihad. As I said, Azam died in 1989. He was assassinated in Peshawar, Pakistan. One of his colleagues in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden, after the August 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, bin Laden approached the Saudi establishment. At the time, he was still on pretty good terms with. They didn't have their serious falling out until 4 years later. And he said, don't bring in the Americans to liberate Kuwait. Let's do the Jihadi International model. Let's do the Azam model of bringing in foreign fighters that assist the local Muslim community to liberate their lands. Osama bin Laden, will raise 100,000 mujahideen from around the Arab world, and we will do in Kuwait what we did in Afghanistan and drive the occupier out. The Saudis, as you no doubt know, declined this offer, and this was actually a fairly major stepping stone in bin Laden's own radicalization vis-a-vis the Saudi regime. All right, so let's move on to the third wave, which of course all Americans excuse me, the second wave that all Americans are familiar with, that begins in the mid-1990s. Fawaz Georgia states it to 95, I date it to 96, when this long speech actually began life as a speech, then was transliterated. There's some issues that one of my colleagues has gotten into about what was said versus what was transliterated and sort of what was left out of the speech. This was not a fatwa, as it's often mistakenly called. It was a declaration, bayan, and then in the sort of the writing itself, it referred to itself as an epistle, as a risala, so a letter, essentially. And what bin Laden is trying to explain is to look at these specific issues, these specific defeats of local jihadi and extremist, Islamists, but primarily jihadi groups in Egypt and Algeria, primarily in Egypt, a low intensity conflict in the 1990s, in Algeria, a very hot civil war. By the mid-90s, 95, 96, it's very clear that the state was going to win in both of these cases and remain in power in Riyadh and everywhere else. That the jihadists, the potential jihadi opposition to the state was going to fail. Another key doctrine, which was called a fatwa, that bin Laden was the chief author of and referred to himself as a sheikh. To my reading, it's the only time he ever referred to himself as somebody that had religious credentials as a sheikh, issuing a fatwa. He got a lot of pushback for doing that. Lots of his followers called him a sheikh to the day he died, but he himself didn't do so, again, to my knowledge. For the Arabic readers here, you can see the Quds al-Arabi headline about this 1998 fatwa that bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and Rafai Taha, who was another Egyptian jihadi, issue a fatwa to kill Americans fi kull makan, in any place in the world. So this is a call to kill military and civilians, right? They were explicit. They were not making any distinction between military and civilians for any able-bodied Muslim anywhere in the world to do so. In a few minutes, I'm going to refer to nihilistic violence. So remember this call for the murder of millions, hundreds of millions of Americans, as an example of that nihilistic violence that I referred to. So what did bin Laden do? What, in the second wave, what did he add to the sort of jihadi strategic studies? What was his goal? And again, very different crisis. For him, the bigger crisis, again, with the defeat in Algeria and Egypt, etc., there was this crisis of the durability of what he viewed as apostate regimes. How could they survive? And he concluded they survived because of the United States. To some degree, US allies, but primarily the United States. And he goes back, bin Laden goes back to the fellow you see on your screen, Mohammed Abdeslam Faraj, Farag, if you like, an Egyptian militant that was the leader of the group that assassinated Anwar Sadat of Egypt in 1981, which is why he is behind bars and was ultimately executed. In the late 70s, Faraj writes this book that's also on your screen, Al-Qa'ida al-Qa'ida, the hidden duty or absent obligation, absent duty has been translated as, and that absent duty, that forgotten duty, was armed jihad. Faraj wrote this to his fellow jihadis to tell them not to focus on the far enemy, which for Faraj was Israel, rather focus on the near enemy. And Faraj makes up this dichotomy. Again, this is not some old Islamic institution. He just made it up in the late 70s to try and make a point. Focus on the near enemy, focus on the regime in Cairo, and don't worry about the far enemy. That would not turn out well for a whole series of reasons that it talks about. Bin Laden comes around and said Faraj was on the right path, but he concluded wrongly. And that is, you can't overthrow near enemy regimes, these apostate regimes in Cairo and elsewhere, until you drive the far enemy out of the region. And for him, the far enemy was not Israel. The far enemy was the United States. So bin Laden concluded his sort of strategic view, saying these apostate regimes aren't going anywhere until we force the Americans to leave the Middle East. And once they just throw up their hands and say goodbye to the Middle East, now these regimes would be much more vulnerable. So Faraj, right idea, but wrong conclusion. And this is why then bin Laden is focused on driving the Americans out of the Middle East in order to weaken these apostate regimes so that they could be overthrown. I compare this, I don't know if any of you remember these old Bobo dolls, about 3 or 4 feet high, plastic, usually painted as a clown. They have a weight in the bottom, typically sand, and you punch them. And every time you punch them, they'd wobble, they'd kind of turn over a bit, but then they always right themselves back up. This is essentially bin Laden's strategic vision, that jihadis can assassinate a president or prime minister or cabinet minister or whatever. They can do a lot of things that makes the regime weaken, tumble a little bit, but the regime always rights itself. And he concluded the reason why the regime always rights itself is because of that connection with the United States in particular, and to some degree a few of its a few of its allies. So this was the flipping the far enemy, near enemy dichotomy was really the most important of bin Laden's ideological innovations. But again, remember, different crisis and a different ideology, a different answer to those crises that is not about occupied territory. It's not about liberating occupied territory. It's about driving the Americans out of the region in order to weaken local apostate regimes. All right. The dating of the second wave, really by 2003 or so, what often was called al-Qa'ida Central, had largely been defeated. I use the year 2011. It's sort of an interesting, how do you periodize things? Simply 2011 is when bin Laden was killed by US Navy SEALs in Abbottabad, Pakistan. So that seemed to be a nice way to close. Again, are there some believers in this second wave, the America first wave of global jihad? Sure, you'll always find some, but it's and the wind has gone out of its sails, and largely it went out of its sails because the rise at that same time of this third wave of global jihad, the ISIS or Caliphate wave. So again, first wave is about liberating territory. Second wave is driving the Americans out to make local regimes vulnerable to overthrow. This third wave is not about either of those two. It's about state building. This is the state building vision of global jihad. It also had specific and general crises. The specific crises was in 2003, the destruction of the Iraqi regime in Baghdad. And from 2003 through 2005, that about 2.5-year period, produced the most radical jihadi literature that has ever been written. And a couple of the books that I will present to you today were written in this time frame, in this 2003 to 2005 time frame. For a lot of ideologues, it wasn't just an issue of the destruction of the Iraqi regime and now the creation of the Shia revivalist, sort of heretical Shia regime in Baghdad, and the Syrian civil war in 2011 that sort of gives ISIS a breath of fresh air, also ruled by an Alawi, even though it's a secular Ba'athist regime, but still the view of being an Alawi Shia regime out of Damascus as well. So, but the general problem, and this is why the state building becomes so important, the general problem that is identified by so many of these ideologues is apostasy itself, not apostate regimes, not anti-Islamic regimes, but apostasy itself, sinful behavior. So how do you build a state in the heart of the Middle East in which apostasy, the temptations of apostasy are not present? So Muslims can live a fully pious Sharia-based, their version of Sharia, based life, again, in the heart of the Middle East, and then expanding out to other Muslim territories from there. This third wave is by far the biggest. There are a lot of ideologues, there are a lot of documents in the book. I go through a fairly large number, but let's just go forward to the innovations. What did ISIS add to this growing global jihad vision? The most important thing I want to emphasize here, again, is the state building aspect. Neither in Afghanistan with the first wave or with bin Laden, the second wave, was there a vision of state building. This wasn't just any state. This was the ISIS state, or the Caliphate, the Dawla Islamiyya, the Islamic State, was a pre-Westphalian state. Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, basically Germanic states agreed that they'll recognize the essential legitimacy of each other. Up to that point, they all thought of themselves as the only legitimate state in the eyes of God. Everybody else was illegitimate. ISIS was a pre-Westphalian state. It did not view any other state in the world as legitimate. It only viewed its own state as legitimate. It didn't play by Westphalian rules. It didn't seek a seat at the United Nations. It did not exchange ambassadors with other countries, nor would it ever have done so. So that's, again, the book focuses on the state building aspect of ISIS. There are a number of ideological innovations above and beyond that state building part. I've got the 6 of them up here on your screen. We have colleagues that have written about the apocalyptic nature of the ISIS ideology, so I won't retell that. The extreme sectarianism has been covered, extreme anti-Shia sectarianism has been covered by a lot of people. Let me just note 2 things. One is the use of violence, this sort of gory, performative, over-the-top violence that was stage managed and downloaded on the internet or uploaded on the internet all the time. A lot of this comes from this book you see in the top right, which has been translated by Professor McCants. The original book was Idarat al-Tawahush, Idara just meaning management or administration, Tawahush meaning savagery, so the management or administration of savagery. Both in terms of liberating territories or putting territory into a gray zone, as they term they use, and then seizing that territory. This kind of gory performative violence can be very useful, as they showed in Mosul in 2014, when just a few hundred ISIS fighters show up at the outskirts of Mosul in northern Iraq, and all the regime's forces melt away with almost not firing a shot, because that Idarat al-Tawahush, that Tawahush that they had demonstrated had been learned, and these people wanted nothing to do with ISIS. The last bullet point too, I think is important, and I spent some time in the book covering it. It's what I call jihadi cool. Jihadi cool. Anarchists of the late 19th, early 20th century often use the phrase propaganda of the deed. Just let your actions speak louder than your words. In this case, don't get into long-winded theological arguments with high-ranking members of the ulama, the clergy. Instead, go out and do cool things. Go out and declare a caliphate. Go out and just do the sort of gory violence and be rewarded for it. Participate in the very extensive sex slave operations that ISIS put on. So, I mean, you could be a 19, 20-year-old young man from the Arab world, from Caucasus, from Europe, wherever. Things that would be abhorrent to the vast majority of Muslims are targeted for these young men who want to live a life of meaning and excitement. And that is what the marketing strategy, this jihadi cool, was really focused on, was the recruitment of young men. And I go into that in some detail in the book. All right, time. Let's move on. The 4th wave, I should say. So when does the 3rd wave end? I say it ends in 2017. Why? Because the territorial state ended in 2017 when ISIS lost Mosul in northern Iraq, and then Raqqa in the Euphrates River Valley in sort of eastern central Syria. The state building, this territorial state, the territorial Dawla Islamiyya was defeated. And so you do not have this territorial state, the thing that made ISIS different from other just kind of regular jihad groups, no longer existed. A 4th wave arises almost at the exact same time as the 3rd wave, but for very different reasons and with a very different vision. It arises out of the destruction of the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. The Taliban regime, following the 9/11 terror attacks in this country, and then the overthrow of the Taliban regime by American coalition forces in late 2001. That sent a lot of jihadi ideologues and sort of battle-hardened jihadis on the run. Many of them went to Pakistan, including the fellow you see at the top of your screen, Abu Musab al-Suri, who was ultimately captured in Pakistan in 2005, turned over to the Americans, and from there, I don't know. There's lots of speculation that he was rendered to Syria. In any case, he hasn't been heard from since 2005, so almost certainly dead. The broader crisis, and so then they have the specific crisis of the loss of Afghanistan, which he viewed as a tremendous defeat for global jihad. He thought that global jihad as a movement was under threat, that it itself was might be killed off, given the number of ideologues and activists and militants that were killed or captured or put on the run. Suri was very, very pessimistic. So his response was to write this very long book, 1,600 pages. It is available online in Arabic. There's only, I believe, one chapter that has ever been translated into English. But you can see it there, Dawah Muqawama al-Islamiyya, al-Alamiyya, the call for global Islamic resistance that came out 2004, 2005 on the internet. He is trying to think of a system that can survive. He's very pessimistic. He does in this book, he does a survey since the early 1960s of jihad groups that have been rolled up and showing just how easy it is for state security forces to defeat jihadi groups, local jihad groups generally. All they need to do is capture one or two members, torture them, get the names of others, grab them, torture them, and very quickly the organization is rolled up. They may have succeeded in assassinating somebody or another, but they're all rolled up in pretty short order by the regime. So he's thinking, how do you create a system, a network system using 21st century technology that is not so easily defeated, that is actually durable, at least until prospects are better for territorial control, and sort of going back to the open warfare models, he says. The key phrase he uses is Nizam la Tanzim. Nizam la Tanzim. And again, Arabic speakers know this is from the same root, so it's a bit of a play on words. Nizam, system, la Tanzim, not organization. So he wants to create a system, not a hierarchical organization that can be fairly easily defeated, but a system that uses the internet and today social media, that uses modern information technologies to create networks of like-minded people, but who don't know each other individually, and so they can't be tortured and give up somebody else's name because they don't know who this person is using these information technologies. Number of characteristics. I refer to this fourth wave as the Jihad Fardi wave. This is just a phrase that Suri uses. Jihad Fardi meaning personal jihad. It's come into English via Mark Sageman's use of the phrase leaderless jihad, but it really does mean personal jihad. It's what we would call lone wolf attacks, individual or small cell attacks, and people who are not logistically controlled or tied to any particular leader or group, but who act autonomously, who are inspired to do what they do by some leader or group, but undertake the planning and the implementation entirely on themselves. This is incidentally what social scientists are increasingly referring to as stochastic violence, stochastic terror. I use that phrase pretty extensively at the back end of my book. And again, this is inspired violence. Stochastic is the term of probability, meaning that if a leader or a group makes a call for violence, you will, in a probabilistic sense, you will have more acts of violence. You can kind of predict that there will be an increase in acts of violence. You just don't know who's going to do it. Knowing which person is going to be radicalized enough that week or that month to get in their car and run over a bunch of people, or if you have Omar Mateen in the bottom, go into a nightclub and murder 50 people and call 911 in the middle of it saying, I'm doing this for ISIS. ISIS didn't even know he existed. There was no connection that we're aware of between Omar Mateen and ISIS or any other group. There's no connection, direct connection that we're aware of between the brothers that pulled off the Boston Marathon bombings and any particular group or leader. Again, autonomous violence that's inspired from the outside, but autonomously implemented. Incidentally, the stochastic violence is not unique to global jihadis. In fact, it was people in the 1990s that were associated with the KKK in the United States that first started thinking about how the internet could be used to advance the cause, to get out the message, call for violence and other activities, but do so in a way that was sort of plausible deniability. So inspired violence, but not something that you could charge a group or a leader with. In fact, one of the people in the 1990s from the KKK that first started thinking about this issue, the use of the internet for this inspired violence, just died a couple of years ago in Fallbrook, California. Again, a longtime member of the KKK. The last point I want to underline on this fourth wave is, again, I coined this term wiki narrative. The Suri himself just uses the word thaqafa, which just means culture, but he's not talking about culture the way we understand it. He's talking about a narrative. And he's specifically talking about a group narrative, not a narrative that is reliant on one or two or three ideologues that can be assassinated fairly easily, but rather thousands of like-minded ideologues that stitch together an ever-evolving narrative, an ever-evolving story about their cause. And they can bring in the latest attack, from Boston, from Orlando, from Vienna last year, or wherever. They can always stitch it together online and to present a story, a powerful story that seems much more compelling and powerful than the sum of a few, at the end of the day, fairly minor murders that have gone on. So this wiki narrative becomes essential. Use of media and creating this kind of wiki narrative was essential for Suri. All right, so over the next 5 minutes or so, let me just step back and say, and this is what I do at the end of the book. So what? Where does, the interesting story about some people that were doing some pretty nasty things, or at least wanted to. Where does this fit into the universe of violent political movements? And again, as a comparativist, the last thing that sort of in my tradition is to just say, oh, it's unique, right? It's sui generis. There's nothing like it in the world, because that's almost always wrong to begin with. And here, I think it very much is. And I make the case that at least after all the violence associated with colonial expansion into the rest of the world, primarily happening in the 19th century, and sort of with the 1917 revolution in Russia to the present day, so the last century, most violence has been undertaken with an avowed Enlightenment ideal behind it. And there are sort of three principal examples of that. One is Leninist violence, or communist, if you will, but more accurately, Leninist violence. The Leninists viewed themselves as the unfolding of history, right? The science of history, and they are the sort of the leaders of this this forward march of liberty, of justice, of science, of everything that the Enlightenment stood for in their own minds. National liberation, mostly post-World War II. Some of those were not so violent, others were very violent. For example, the revolution in Algeria against the French occupation from 1954 to 1962. So again, but this is under the name of liberty, freedom, Enlightenment ideals. And even fascism, this I know is a bit of a provocative argument, an element of fascism is very much based on the material progress of humankind. And when we think of fascism, we too quickly think of the Nazis as opposed to the Italians or the Spanish or others. Fascism was and remains a very popular ideology because it promises material progress, but of a conservative hue, a law and order hue, a pro-religion hue very often. And so here, just as an example of this, I have this poster from Italy in the mid-30s, 1936, with Mussolini himself leading the destruction of the Spina neighborhood in Rome. He did this in a lot of places to build big monuments, big boulevards, big shrines to the greatness of the Italian nation. So if you've ever been to St. Peter's Square, you have this really nice view right down to the Tiber River and the Castello on the left. Well, you didn't have that view in 1935 or 34 or 33. The Spina neighborhood was there. That has been destroyed by Mussolini in the name of progress, in the name of the advance of the material progress of the Italian nation to create this big boulevard and all of that. All right, so I argue that the vast majority of violence in recent decades has come from one of those three sources. But there have been other groups that don't make any claim to enlightenment based ideals. And this I'm drawing on some work that Ken Jowett did in the 1990s. I've taken some of his concepts and sort of worked with them a bit. I think I've made them more appropriate to the study of this kind of unique group, set of, not unique, but this set of groups of violent political movements that are not based on any sort of self-notion of enlightenment. Two characteristics stand out for this subset of groups. One is nihilistic violence. And I said, remember the bin Laden call for the murder of 300 million Americans as an example of that. Nihilistic, not in the philosophical sense. This is not meaningless violence, but nihilism in the political sense, the way 19th century Russian anarchists used the term nihilism, which was system destroying violence, root and branch violence, really over the top violence beyond sort of any kind of normal calculation of what was needed for any particular goal. So nihilistic violence and apocalyptic anti-enlightenment ideology. Apocalyptic, again, we've had people, fellow scholars, write on the apocalyptic nature of the ISIS ideology. And this means always we have to go through, right now, we have to go through end times, hard struggles. I mean, this is going to be bloody and nasty, but there is a nirvana of some sort on the other side. Better days are going to be on the other side of this Armageddon or David-like confrontation. And I make the case that cultural contamination is a major part of this apocalyptic anti-enlightenment ideology, that there are elements within each country that are carriers of cultural contamination that essentially need to be exterminated. I coined this term gnocicide. Gnosis from the Greek meaning knowledge, side, the suffix in Latin meaning the killing of, so the killing of knowledge or the killing of those with knowledge. So movements of rage feature gnocicide. They feature these two characteristics, but including this element of cultural contamination and the need to purify society. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia are probably the best example of a movement of rage. What is the first thing they did when they came to power in the mid-1970s? They emptied Phnom Penh of its inhabitants. This was the epicenter of cultural contamination. People that wore ties, wore glasses, spoke a foreign language, showed other symptoms of cultural contamination were the ones that were executed immediately or sent out in the killing fields for a little bit more drawn out execution, typically. The Red Guards in China, in their origin, that launched this horrible cultural revolution in China from 1966 to 72. Again, another movement of rage, I would argue. Boko Haram in Nigeria, before it got caught up in the global jihad issue, was a good local example of a movement of rage. I argue in the book that the Brownshirts from the 1920s up until 1934 in Nazi Germany, the Brownshirts, they were eliminated. Hitler didn't need them anymore in 1934, except the night of the long knives, when Hitler was getting rid of the Brownshirts. Who were they? Semi-literate white men from the countryside. It should sound familiar to you. These were the protectors of Nazi rallies, the protectors of Nazi leaders. Again, the muscle, the thugs of the Nazi movement up until 1934, when they were no longer necessary. I make the argument in the book as well that elements of white nationalism today, not just the United States, but elsewhere, some of that also constitutes a movement of rage as well. So global jihad is a variant form. Why a variant form of a movement of rage? Well, first of all, it shares those characteristics. It's a movement of rage in that it, in each case I'm talking about, it espouses a vision of nihilistic violence and has an apocalyptic ideology in which an attack, a gnocicide, an attack on those with knowledge, technical knowledge, Western knowledge often. And I don't mean to say 100% of the time, but there's a clear impetus in this direction. I mean, that goes back to Said Qutb, who was not a global jihadi, but a local jihadi. But the sort of cultural contamination element has been very prominent in the writings of various of these ideologues. A variant form, though, because this, what I'm studying, is done at the global level. It is not a local phenomenon. Most of what I just talked about, with the exception of white nationalism, was a local group in a single country. Global jihad, like white nationalism today, is very much situated at the international level, not in one particular country. So with that, I probably went a few minutes past what I should have, but I want to thank you very much for your time. And we still have half an hour or so for discussion, questions, comments. Andrew, I will turn it over to you so you can take charge of the technology and let me know what people want to talk about.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So we do have one question, though. If you do have any questions out there, definitely please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. So we have an anonymous question here. Have you seen in your research any trends in growing fake or faux stochastic terror activity? That is, acts undertaken not by ideological adherents, but by groups seeking to capitalize on social fears from calls to action?
That's a great question that I don't have a good answer for. I've not studied that particular issue. The folks that I'm looking at tended to always claim credit when they when they undertook an action, and only rarely. I mean, it did happen sometimes where they claimed credit for an action that they didn't do, but these were sort of things on the margin. Usually they were fairly upfront in what they did, and the use of vocabulary was an important determinant. So I mentioned Omar Mateen, for example, the Pulse nightclub shooter in Orlando, Florida. It's clear that ISIS had no idea that he existed, that he was planning on doing anything, and much less that he would do it in their name. They were pleased. They put out a statement saying, good on Omar Mateen, a soldier of the caliphate. That is the way they would word it whenever they were surprised by a stochastic act of violence that somebody claimed in their name. This is the phrasing they would use for the perpetrator, that he was a soldier of the caliphate. And that was ISIS's way of knowing, or letting the world know, we had no idea this guy was about to do what he did. We've had no contact with him, but good on him for doing it. So the folks that I'm looking at have been pretty upfront. Again, I don't want to say 100% of the time, but pretty upfront in claiming credit for what they did, and if something happened that wasn't them, they would again, sometimes they have, but very rarely would they claim credit for something that they didn't do. So just kind of stepping back and looking at violence writ large, I don't think this happens. I don't think this happens very often. I don't think that you get claims, especially like a claim that something's going to happen that doesn't happen. Now, there are fire, people pull the fire alarm and that kind of stuff, and there is no real emergency. But what I don't see a ton of violent activity that somebody claims in another person's name. I mean, this is, I'm not trying to get political here, but I mean, this is essentially what the right wing in this country is now talking about, the January 6th insurrection on Capitol Hill. And it's ludicrous, but it's all over right wing media that this was a false flag operation, that their guys didn't do it. It was set up primarily by the FBI that did various things to, lure folks in and get them to do something so that they could shut down the, conservative America. So you hear those kind of conspiracy theories out there, but I mean, they're generally just not true. And the people that I'm looking at, that kind of stuff generally does not happen.
We have one question here from Professor John Esposito, our founding director. What is your judgment regarding the effectiveness of CVE?
So this is the Countering Violent Extremism program. And hi, John. Good to see you again, if only digitally. So let me take a step back, and so instead of talking about kind of the specific CVE elements, I mean, I appreciate the thought. I appreciate that there are smart people in the U.S. government that are trying to think in creative ways as to how one can neutralize really violent types of ideology. So there have been some, some good things done. There's been a lot of things that haven't worked very well. The re-education programs that the Saudis have done, for example, and others, they may have done a little bit of good, probably not a whole lot. But in terms of the kind of the policy formulation that comes out of this reality that we're seeing of, in this case, global jihadis, and particularly fourth wave, again, individually inspired jihadis. The most important thing in my mind, and I put this in the book, is to right-size the threat. Don't exaggerate the threat. I think in the aftermath of 9/11, for many, many years, we tended to exaggerate the threat that global jihad represented. I think today we're just forgetting about it, right? With the pivot to Asia, the China focus, the great power conflict, the great power rivalry, we tended to maybe forget about it too much. So kind of right-sizing it, doing what you can, recognizing that the Americans have never been very good about, winning ideological wars in the Middle East or elsewhere. But again, there are some of the CVE programs that I think were well intended and probably had some positive impact. But there's the more important kind of normal police work, normal kind of intelligence sharing that is much better today than it used to be. Not demonizing entire communities, which closes off the possibility of what's often called community policing. I mean, working with communities to identify people that may be radicalizing at that moment. So you can just kind of keep an eye on various folks. That becomes, and we've had a history of that in this country. It's become very difficult when entire Muslim communities get demonized. So there are sort of a number of common sense law enforcement techniques that can be done, but also political leadership is necessary to stop as many of these fourth wave attacks as one can. We have stopped a number of them. Most Americans don't even know the ones that have been stopped. But you're not going to stop all of them. But there's some sort of common sense law enforcement measures that can be undertaken to help the situation. And again, I think elements of CVE, I'm not trying to be critical. I think elements of it, again, well-intended and may have made a bit of a difference, but we shouldn't exaggerate its effectiveness.
It looks like this may be probably the last question that we've received. So if you do want to go into any closing thoughts, or perhaps give folks an understanding of how to access your book or any articles related to your book, that might be helpful for those listening.
I had up here. Let me try and put it back up. If people are interested, there are a couple of ways that you can get the book. One is I've dropped off a few copies at the center here, so they can be found on the shelves if you want to come read it. My sharing is not working for some reason, but anyway. Or you can go straight to Stanford University Press and order the books. The paperback is $25. If you use Robinson20, the code Robinson20, you get $5 off. You can buy it for $20. So those are the best ways to get your hands on the actual book. And let me just follow up. As I said, the last part of the book, I'm deliberately being comparative and to some degree provocative. And I would love to get, after people have had a chance to read the book, not just feedback on my interpretation of these 4 iterations of global jihad, but also my analysis of where it fits into the broader universe of political violence that we've seen, again, over the last 80 to 100 years. I'd love to have that conversation. My email is, I think it was on the title slide, but just robinson@nps for Naval Postgraduate School, nps.edu. And I'd be delighted to engage in any and all discussion on the topic.
Professor, it looks like we have had one additional Q&A question come in, if you do have time.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so this is from an anonymous attendee. It says, in light of the new realities in Afghanistan, where the Taliban movements, local movements, focus on fighting inside Afghanistan, a local jihad, from points of view, what are the repercussions of such events on jihadist movements, ideologies, and methods of action?
Yeah, and this is a great question. This is, I think, from a policy perspective, the $64,000 question. The Taliban are not a movement of rage. I don't qualify them as that. You don't fight against the Americans, fight and win against the Americans over 20 years without having some learning, some nimbleness, some smarts in the meantime. So, and the Taliban itself has changed considerably over the last 20 years to present itself, at least its self-conceptualization and the way they present themselves to fellow Afghanis as a movement of national liberation to drive the foreign occupiers out. So anyway, Taliban is not, in my mind, the 2021 version of the Taliban is not a movement of rage. So the issue there, the $64,000 question is, what has the Taliban learned over the last 20 years? And have they learned that they, we live in a Westphalian system, even though, ISIS was a pre-Westphalian state. The Taliban of Afghanistan is not. It is a Westphalian state. Has it learned that within the Westphalian rules, it can do almost anything it wants inside its own country without risking its survival as a regime, as long as it doesn't do one thing. And that one thing is what they were doing in the late 90s, and that is allowing foreign militants, often terrorists, again, if you're attacking civilians, that's where the word terrorism comes into play, who would then train and then take their tools on the road to attack the U.S. on 9/11, of course, but other places as well. So if the Taliban has learned that it can't do that, and it has fought so-called ISIS Khorasan, ISIS-K in Afghanistan, there's no love lost there. There was some intermarriage between Taliban leadership and al-Qa'ida leadership back in the late 90s, early 2000s, before 9/11. So there's some family connection that they would need to honor, but that's different from letting these sorts of militants set up training camps that they're going to use to attack countries outside of Afghanistan. So that's the $64,000 question. Have they learned that lesson? My guess is yes. I mean, they're working with the Chinese currently on counterterrorism issues, primarily focused on ISIS-K, for example. My guess is that they have learned that lesson. They will do lots of, in my mind, horrible things to their own population, but I don't think they will cross that red line again. And you can bet that the U.S. intelligence community and everybody else is watching that very closely. And this is not something that you can hide in the year 2021. So to the degree that they have territorial control over Afghanistan, I suspect in that territory, they will not allow the kind of training camps and activities that they allowed al-Qa'ida and others to do in the 1990s. But that, that is something, that's an empirical question that we'll be able to answer as we observe what goes on in Afghanistan in the coming months and years.
Well, I think that about does it for questions from the audience. But I just wanted to thank, on behalf of the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, you coming and giving your talk on what is an amazing book. Yes, if anyone does have any questions, we do have all information on our website, and we'll be posting a video version of this talk within the coming week. So with links to the book and everything. So thank you so much, Professor. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.